In 1897, a sawyer named Thomas Henley stood 3 feet from a spinning blade that measured 5 feet across. The rim of that blade was traveling at over 600 miles per hour, faster than a bullet from a pistol, faster than the human eye could track, and Thomas had been standing in that exact spot, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, for 11 years. On a Tuesday morning in March, a knot in a white pine log caught the blade wrong. The saw grabbed the timber and threw it backward with enough force to crush a man's rib cage. But the log missed Thomas by inches. What didn't miss him was the blade tooth that snapped free from the impact. A chunk of steel the size of a man's thumb, traveling at 600 miles per hour, tore through his left shoulder and embedded itself in the wall 20 feet behind him. Thomas Henley bled out on the sawdust floor of the Patterson Mill in Saginaw, Michigan. He was 43 years old. He left behind a wife, 4 children, and a debt to the company store that his family would spend the next 2 years paying off. His name does not appear in any official record of workplace fatalities. The mill recorded his death as an accident due to worker negligence. By Thursday, another man stood in his place. This was not unusual. This was Tuesday. The circular saw blade that killed Thomas Henley was, at the time, the most sophisticated piece of cutting technology the world had ever seen. It could reduce a massive old-growth log to lumber in minutes. It could process more wood in an hour than a team of men with handsaws could process in a week. It was the engine of American expansion. The tool that built the railroads and the cities and the farms that stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It was also, by a wide margin, the most dangerous machine that American workers had ever faced. And for nearly a century, men climbed onto platforms mere inches from its spinning edge, and they stayed there until the whistle blew or until something went wrong. Today we're going to talk about what it was actually like to work beside those blades. Not the sanitized version, not the version where progress was inevitable and sacrifice was noble. The real version, the one where men went to work knowing with absolute certainty that the blade spinning beside them could kill them in an instant, and they went anyway, because there was no other choice. If you've never stood next to a running circular saw, you can't truly understand what these men experienced, but I'm going to try to put you there. The first thing you'd notice before you even entered the mill was the sound. A circular saw blade running at full speed produces a scream that you feel in your teeth. It's not a mechanical hum. It's not a whine. It's a sustained, high-pitched shriek that penetrates your skull and settles somewhere behind your eyes. The men who worked these saws for years often went partially deaf, and some of them said the deafness was a mercy, because at least then, the sound didn't follow them home. The second thing you'd notice was the vibration. Everything shook. The platform you stood on, the walls, the floor. The entire structure of the mill trembled with the power of the steam engine driving those belts and pulleys. You felt it in your legs, in your spine, in your jaw. After a 12-hour shift, men reported that the world still seemed to be vibrating, even when they closed their eyes to sleep. The third thing, and this is the one that survivors talk about most, was the smell. Fresh-cut wood has a pleasant scent when you're walking through a forest. But when you're standing next to a blade that's cutting through pine at 600 miles per hour, that scent becomes overwhelming. It fills your lungs, it coats your skin, it mixes with the smell of hot metal and machine oil and sawdust and sweat. And underneath all of it, if you'd been working in these mills long enough, you could smell something else. You could smell the blood that had soaked into the wooden platforms, the blood that never quite washed out. Now let me tell you about the blade itself. The circular saw, as we know it, was invented in the late 1700s, but it didn't become the dominant force in American lumber production until the 1850s. Before that, most sawmills used what were called muley saws, or up-and-down saws. These were vertical blades that moved in a straight line, cutting the log as they traveled up and down. They were slow, they were inefficient, but they were also relatively predictable. The circular saw changed everything. A blade spinning in a continuous motion could cut faster than any reciprocating saw. And as the technology improved, those blades got bigger and faster. By the 1880s, the standard circular saw blade in an American lumber mill measured between 48 and 60 inches in diameter. Some of the larger operations used blades that were 6 feet across. Here's where the physics gets terrifying. A circular saw blade doesn't just spin, it whips. The center of the blade, where it's bolted to the arbor, might be moving at a relatively modest speed. But the edge, the rim where the teeth are, is traveling at a completely different velocity. On a 5-foot blade running at the standard speed of that era, the rim was moving at over 9,000 feet per minute. That translates to roughly 600 miles per hour. Think about that for a moment. The teeth of that blade were traveling faster than the muzzle velocity of many firearms, and those teeth were designed to cut through wood, which meant they were designed to cut through anything softer than steel. Human flesh is considerably softer than steel. The men who worked these saws understood, on some level, what they were standing next to. But human beings are remarkably good at normalizing danger. When you face the same threat every day, when everyone around you faces the same threat, when the threat becomes simply part of the landscape of your existence, you stop seeing it as exceptional. You just see it as work. The sawyer's job was to guide logs into the blade. He stood on a platform called the carriage, which rolled back and forth on tracks, carrying the log into and away from the saw. His job was to position the log correctly, to read the grain, to anticipate how the wood would react when the blade bit into it. A good sawyer could produce more lumber with less waste than a careless one. And in an industry where profit margins were measured in fractions of cents per board foot, a good sawyer was valuable. But standing 3 feet from a blade traveling at 600 miles per hour leaves no room for error, none. A moment's distraction, a slight misjudgment, a log that behaves differently than expected, and you are simply gone. The most common way that sawyers died was kickback. Kickback happens when a log binds on the blade. Maybe there's a hidden knot, maybe the grain twists unexpectedly, maybe the log shifts on the carriage. Whatever the cause, the result is the same. The blade grabs the log and throws it. Not gently, not slowly. The blade throws that log backward with all the force of a 600-mile-per-hour impact. A log thrown by kickback doesn't just slide back along the carriage. It launches. Men have been hit by logs traveling 40, 50, 60 feet through the air after being thrown by a saw blade. A piece of timber that might weigh 300 pounds becomes a projectile, and anything in its path simply ceases to exist in recognizable form. But kickback, as terrible as it was, wasn't even the most feared danger in the sawmill. That honor belonged to the blade itself. Circular saw blades of that era were made of tempered steel. They were precision instruments, carefully balanced and tensioned, so they would run true at high speeds. The teeth were individually filed and set, usually by a specialized worker called a filer, whose only job was to maintain the blades. But steel, even tempered steel, has limits. Run it long enough, stress it hard enough, heat it and cool it through thousands of cycles, and it will eventually fail. And when a saw blade fails, it doesn't just stop working, it becomes a bomb. A blade crack could happen without warning. One moment, the saw is running normally. The next, a section of the rim tears free and flies outward at whatever speed the blade was turning. We're talking about chunks of steel weighing several pounds, traveling at hundreds of miles per hour, spraying through the air in whatever direction physics happens to dictate. Sawmill workers called these events blade throws. Survivors describe them as being caught in an explosion. Steel fragments tore through walls, shattered windows, killed men who weren't even standing near the saw. One account from a mill in Wisconsin describes a blade throw that killed 3 men and injured 7 more, all from a single blade failure. And it wasn't just cracks. Individual teeth could break free as well. Those teeth, from hardened steel points designed to bite through wood, would launch from the spinning blade like bullets. They could penetrate wooden walls. They could penetrate human bodies. They could kill a man standing 30 feet away without warning. Thomas Henley, the sawyer I mentioned at the beginning, died from a single broken tooth. One piece of steel, no larger than a thumb, traveling fast enough to punch through his shoulder and keep going. It happens that quickly. One moment you're standing at your station, doing the job you've done 1,000 times before. The next moment, something gives, and you simply stop existing. Now, you might be asking yourself a reasonable question. If these blades were so dangerous, why didn't the mills install guards? Why didn't they protect the workers from the most obvious threats? The answer is as simple as it is infuriating. Guards cost money, dead workers were free. That's not an exaggeration. That's not hyperbole. That is a plain statement of how the lumber industry operated for decades. A sawmill owner could hire a replacement worker within hours of losing one. The only cost was the inconvenience. But installing blade guards, building protective barriers, implementing safety protocols, those required capital investment. Those cut into profit margins. Those made the accountants uncomfortable. So they didn't happen. Not because they were impossible, not because the technology didn't exist, but because the men who owned the mills made a calculated decision that worker lives were worth less than the cost of protecting them. Let me be clear about what I'm saying. This wasn't negligence in the sense of ignorance. The mill owners knew the blades were dangerous. They knew men were dying. They had the bodies to prove it. They knew that guards and stops and barriers would prevent at least some of those deaths, and they chose not to install them. They made a business decision, and that decision, made in boardrooms and offices far from the screaming blades, condemned thousands of men to die. The workers themselves knew this. They understood exactly what their lives were worth to the men who signed their paychecks. But what were they going to do? Quit? And go where? The lumber towns of the 19th century were company towns. The mill was the only employer, the company store was the only store, the company housing was the only housing. You worked where they told you to work, under the conditions they set, for the wages they offered, or you starved. This wasn't a market of free workers making free choices. This was a system designed to trap men in dangerous jobs and keep them there until the job killed them. Let's talk about what happened when something went wrong. In a modern workplace, there are emergency stops. There are kill switches. There are protocols for shutting down machinery immediately when an accident occurs. In a 19th century sawmill, none of that existed. The entire mill ran on a single power system. One massive steam engine drove everything through a network of belts and pulleys and drive shafts. If something went wrong at the saw, you couldn't just hit a button and stop the blade. The blade was connected to the same power system as everything else. To stop the saw, you had to stop the entire mill. And stopping the mill cost money. Every minute the engine wasn't running was a minute of lost production. So the culture in most mills was simple. Unless something catastrophic happened, you didn't stop the line. You dealt with problems while everything kept running. This meant that when accidents happened, they happened at full speed. If a man got caught in a belt, he went through the belt at full speed. If a log kicked back, it kicked back at full speed. If a blade grabbed a piece of wood wrong, everything happened at full speed. There was no emergency stop. There was no automatic shutdown. There was just the machine doing what the machine did, and human bodies in the path of it. Workers who survived serious injuries in sawmills often described feeling almost detached from what was happening to them. The speed of the accidents was so fast, the violence so total, and that their minds couldn't process it in real time. They would realize afterward that they had lost a hand, or that their leg was gone below the knee, or that the blood spreading across the sawdust floor was their own. But in the moment, the human brain simply couldn't keep up with what was being done to the human body. Here's a detail that you won't find in most histories of the lumber industry. The platforms where sawyers stood were built of wood. That wood was porous. It absorbed liquids. After enough years of operation, the wood in those platforms was saturated with blood. The blood of men who had been cut, crushed, torn apart, eviscerated, the blood of men who had died where they stood. The mills would occasionally replace the worst sections of platform, but they never replaced it all. There was always blood underfoot. The workers knew they were standing on the accumulated evidence of every man who had fallen before them. Some workers reported that on hot days, when the humidity rose and the steam from the engine filled the mill, you could smell it. The old blood, baking in the heat, releasing its iron tang into the air. It mixed with the sawdust and the pine resin and the machine oil. And the men kept working, because what else were they going to do? I want to take you through a typical shift in one of these mills. I want you to understand what these men lived every day for years on end. You'd wake before dawn, not because you wanted to, but because the whistle would blow at 5, and you needed time to eat whatever cold breakfast your wife had prepared before walking to the mill. The walk might take 10 minutes, or it might take 40, or depending on where the company had placed your housing. You walked in the dark, usually in the cold, often in rain or snow. The Pacific Northwest logging country wasn't kind to men who had to travel on foot. You arrived at the mill before 6. The engine would already be running, building steam for the day's production. You could hear it from a quarter-mile away, that low industrial throb that meant work and danger and survival all at once. Inside, you took your position. If you were a sawyer, that meant climbing onto the carriage platform and checking the blade. Was it running true? Were all the teeth intact? Was the tension right? You looked for cracks, for wobbles, for any sign that the blade might be failing, but you only had a few minutes to look. Production started at 6, and the logs started coming whether you were ready or not. For the next 12 hours, you stood beside that blade. You guided logs into it. You adjusted the carriage. You communicated with the other workers through hand signals. Because the noise was too loud for speech, you watched the wood, you watched the blade, you watched for any sign that something was about to go wrong, and you did all of this while exhausted, because you had done the same thing yesterday, and the day before that, and the day before that, 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, week after week, month after month. The fatigue accumulated, your reactions slowed, your attention wandered, and the blade, indifferent to your exhaustion, kept spinning at 600 miles per hour. The accidents that killed men in sawmills weren't usually caused by inexperience. They were caused by exhaustion. Men who had done the job for years, who knew the dangers intimately, who had survived 1,000 close calls, would make a single mistake at the end of a long shift. They would misjudge a log. They would react a half-second too slowly. They would let their attention drift for just a moment. And that moment was all it took. The blade didn't care how many years you had worked beside it. The blade didn't care how many mouths you had to feed at home. The blade didn't care that you were tired and hungry and sore and your feet had gone numb from standing on that platform for 11 hours straight. The blade just kept spinning. And if you put yourself in its path, even for an instant, it would tear you apart without hesitation. The lunch break, if you got one, was 30 minutes. You ate on the mill floor, usually, because there was no cafeteria and no time to walk anywhere else. You ate with sawdust on your hands and in your hair. You ate while the blade kept spinning 15 feet away, ready to go back to full operation the moment the foreman gave the signal. And then you worked 6 more hours. Until 6 in the evening, usually, though during the busy season it might be 7 or 8. And then you walked home in the dark, ate whatever dinner was waiting, and collapsed into bed knowing that you'd do the same thing again tomorrow. This was life in the sawmills. This was what it meant to be one of the men who built America's cities and railroads and farms. This was the debt that was paid in blood and bone and exhaustion for every board foot of lumber that went into the buildings we still use today. Now, let me tell you about some specific dangers that made the circular saw even more terrifying than I've already described. Sawdust was one of them. When you cut wood at high speed, you produce enormous quantities of sawdust. Fine, dry particles of wood that float in the air, settle on every surface, and accumulate in every corner. The sawmills of the 19th century were filled with sawdust. It was everywhere, in the air you breathed, in the food you ate, in your clothes, and your hair, and your lungs. Sawdust, at sufficient concentration, is explosive. The same principle that makes flour dust dangerous in a grain elevator applies to sawdust in a sawmill. Suspend enough fine particles in the air, introduce a spark, and you don't get a fire. You get a detonation. The sawdust doesn't burn sequentially, and the way a log would burn in a fireplace. It burns all at once simultaneously, with explosive force. Sawmill explosions were not uncommon. A friction spark from a belt, a hot bearing, a lantern knocked over in the winter darkness, any source of ignition could trigger a catastrophic explosion that would destroy the mill and kill everyone inside it. And here's the terrible irony. The same sawdust that made the mills explosive also made them more dangerous in another way. Sawdust on the floor was slippery. Men working near spinning blades trying to maintain their balance on platforms covered with fine wood particles, slipped and fell into machinery. The very byproduct of the work became another instrument of death. The belts and pulleys that transferred power from the steam engine to the saws were another constant danger. Everything in a 19th century sawmill ran on belt power. Leather belts, sometimes several feet wide, ran at high speed along pulleys and drive shafts. These belts were everywhere, above your head, beside you, running through gaps in the floor beneath your feet. And they were running constantly as long as the engine was running. If your clothing caught on a belt, you were gone. The belt would pull you into the pulley faster than you could react. Men were dragged into machinery, wrapped around drive shafts, crushed between pulleys. The injuries from belt accidents were often the most gruesome in the mill because the belts didn't just cut you. They grabbed you and pulled you into whatever machinery they were driving. They fed you into the works. Workers learned to wear tight-fitting clothes, no loose sleeves, no dangling fabric, hair tied back or cut short. Any projecting piece of clothing could catch on a passing belt and end your life. But even with precautions, accidents happened. A moment's carelessness, a piece of fabric that worked loose during a shift, a tool that fell and caught in the wrong place. The belts didn't stop. The belts didn't care. The belts just kept running, and anything that got in their way was pulled along with them. The steam engines that powered these mills were themselves sources of danger. Boiler explosions were a constant threat. The technology of pressure vessels was still developing, and the maintenance of mill equipment was often deferred to save money. Boilers would be run beyond their safe limits. Safety valves would be disabled to increase pressure. And every so often, a boiler would fail catastrophically, and sending shrapnel and scalding steam through the mill. A boiler explosion didn't just kill the men nearest to it. The blast could tear through walls, collapse roofs, set fires that spread through the sawdust-filled interior. Some of the worst industrial disasters of the 19th century were sawmill boiler explosions, killing dozens of men in a single instant. But let me return to the saw itself, because the saw was where most men met their end. There were different types of saws used in these mills, and each one had its own particular dangers. The circular saw was the primary cutting tool, but it wasn't alone. Gang saws used multiple blades running in parallel to cut a log into several boards at once. These saws were particularly dangerous because they created multiple cutting surfaces, multiple opportunities for something to go wrong, multiple blades that could throw a tooth or crack under stress. Edger saws trimmed the rough edges off boards after the primary cut. These were smaller circular saws, but they ran just as fast, and they required workers to handle lumber that was passing directly beside the spinning blade. Edger injuries were among the most common in the mill, because the work required putting your hands close to the blade repeatedly, thousands of times per shift. Trim saws cut boards to length. Again, smaller blades, but the same terrible speed, the same unforgiving physics. And then there were the resaws, which cut thick lumber into thinner boards. These machines required workers to feed wood into a horizontal blade, standing directly in the path that the wood would travel if the saw kicked it back. Resaw operators worked in what was essentially a kill zone, relying on skill and luck to avoid the inevitable. Each of these machines took lives. Each of these machines maimed workers who were lucky enough to survive. The total toll of injury and death across all the saws in a single mill over the course of a single year was staggering. But the records were never kept with any accuracy because the workers didn't matter enough to count. Here's something that should make you angry. The technology to make these machines safer existed. It had existed for decades. Blade guards, emergency stops, safety protocols, training programs, all of these things were technically possible. Some European mills had begun implementing them. Some American manufacturers offered safety equipment as optional accessories. But in the American lumber industry, these measures were systematically rejected, not because they didn't work, because they cost money. And in the cold calculus of 19th century capitalism, worker lives were the cheapest resource available. I've seen the accounting records from mills of this era. I've seen how they tracked lumber output down to the board foot, how they calculated profit margins to the fraction of a cent. And in those same records, Worker deaths are mentioned as minor inconveniences, if they're mentioned at all. Lost 2 days' production due to accident might be the only reference to a man being killed by a blade. 2 days' production. That was the cost of a human life. The workers knew this. They understood their position perfectly, and yet they kept working day after day, standing beside those spinning blades, sheer because the alternative was starvation, because the system was designed to give them no other choice. Let me tell you about a man named Samuel Briggs. Samuel worked as a sawyer at a mill in Oregon for 7 years. He was considered one of the best in the territory, a man who could read wood like other men read books, who had an intuition for how a log would behave when it met the blade. He had survived countless close calls. He had the scars to prove it. 3 fingers missing from his left hand, taken by a trim saw in his 2nd year. A long scar across his chest from a splinter that had been thrown by the blade at high velocity. Partial deafness in both ears from years of standing beside that screaming steel. Samuel was 34 years old and had a wife and 3 children when the blade finally claimed him. It was a routine cut. A log that looked like every other log he had guided into the saw that day. But somewhere in the heart of that pine was a defect, an inclusion of dense resin that the blade couldn't cut cleanly. The saw grabbed, the log torqued, and before Samuel could react, the timber swung on the carriage and pushed him into the blade. The blade caught his hip and pulled him in. His co-workers couldn't stop the machine. There was no emergency stop. They had to run to the engine house 50 yards away and signal the engineer to shut down the whole mill. By the time the blade stopped spinning, Samuel Briggs had been torn apart from the hip to the shoulder. He was still alive when they pulled what remained of him away from the saw. He lived for another 17 minutes, conscious for most of it, before blood loss finally took him. His wife was not notified until the end of the shift, because stopping production to send a messenger would have cost the company money. Samuel's oldest son was 12. Within a month, he was working in the same mill, feeding the edger saw, standing in his father's blood that still stained the wooden platform. Because the family needed the income, because the company store still wanted payment on the debt Samuel had accumulated, because there was no other choice. This was not unusual. This was the system working as designed. I want you to understand that the men who died in these sawmills were not abstractions. They were not statistics. They were fathers and sons and husbands and brothers. They were human beings who woke up each morning and kissed their families goodbye and walked to work knowing that the kiss might be their last. They did this because the alternative was watching their children starve. They did this because the men who owned the mills had structured a system that gave them no other option. The names of most of these men are lost. The records were never kept, or they were destroyed, or they simply listed worker without any further identification. We know from partial records and contemporary accounts that thousands of men died in American sawmills during the height of the lumber boom. The actual number is certainly much higher, but we will never know the real toll because the men who died weren't considered important enough to count. There's another aspect of sawmill work that deserves attention. The men who survived the blades often didn't survive them whole. The amputation rate in sawmills was staggering. Fingers were the most common loss, taken by trim saws and edgers in moments of inattention or mechanical failure. Hands went next, pulled into blades or crushed by rolling logs. Arms, legs. Feet caught in belt drives or crushed under falling timber. The sawmill towns were filled with men missing pieces of themselves. You could identify a veteran sawmill worker by what he was missing. 3 fingers meant he'd worked the edger. A hand meant a close call with the main blade. A leg below the knee usually meant a belt accident or a log that rolled wrong. These men, the survivors with missing pieces, were often still expected to work. A man missing fingers could still pull lumber. A man missing a hand could still sweep sawdust. A man missing a leg could still sort boards if someone built him a crude wooden limb. The mill didn't provide compensation for injuries. The mill didn't provide medical care beyond what the company doctor could patch together. The mill just expected you to adapt or leave. And if you left, you got nothing. Not a pension, not a disability payment, not even an acknowledgement that you had given pieces of your body to make the owners wealthy. You just walked away, or hobbled away with whatever you had left. The company doctors deserved their own mention. Most sawmill towns had a single physician, paid by the mill, whose job was to keep workers functional enough to return to the line. These weren't healers in any meaningful sense. They were mechanics, patching human machines just well enough to get a few more weeks of labor out of them. A bad cut might get a few stitches and a wrap of dirty bandage. A broken bone would be set after a fashion with whatever splints were available. A severe injury that couldn't be quickly repaired would be dealt with through amputation, often performed on a table in the company office with nothing more than whiskey for anesthesia and a saw that looked disturbingly similar to the tools used on lumber. Infection killed almost as many sawmill workers as the machines themselves. In an era before antibiotics, before sterile technique was widely understood, any wound that broke the skin was an invitation for gangrene, blood poisoning, tetanus. Men who survived blade injuries often died weeks later, feverish and delirious, as infection spread through their bodies. The mills didn't track these deaths as workplace fatalities. If a man was injured at the mill but died at home 2 weeks later from infection, his death was simply a death. Natural causes. God's will. Certainly not the responsibility of the men who had put him beside the blade in the first place. Let me tell you about the night shifts. Some mills ran around the clock, trying to maximize production from their expensive equipment. This meant workers had to staff the blades through the night, working by lantern light and the glow of the boiler fires. Night work was even more dangerous than day work. The poor lighting made it harder to read the wood, harder to see problems developing, harder to notice the small signs that something was about to go wrong. Exhaustion was worse at night, when the body naturally wanted to sleep, when attention flagged and reaction time slowed, and the darkness created psychological pressure. And the mill at night was a different place than the mill by day. The shadows shifted. The machinery seemed louder, more menacing. The blade, catching flickers of lantern light, seemed almost alive, a predatory thing waiting for the moment when your attention wavered. Men who worked night shifts reported nightmares. They reported seeing the blade in their sleep, spinning forever, waiting. They reported waking in the darkness of their company housing, heart pounding, certain they had heard the scream of steel biting wood. Some of them never got over it. Some of them carried that sound in their heads for the rest of their lives, long after they had left the mills behind. The physical toll of sawmill work extended beyond injuries. The men who survived the blades often developed respiratory problems from years of breathing sawdust. Their lungs filled with wood particles that never cleared, creating chronic conditions that shortened their lives even if the machines never touched them. Hearing loss was nearly universal among long-term sawmill workers. The constant scream of the blade at close range destroyed the delicate structures of the inner ear. Men in their 30s had the hearing of men in their 70s. By the time they were too old to work the saws, many of them were effectively deaf. The vibration of the machinery damaged joints and nerves. Workers developed what we would now recognize as repetitive strain injuries, chronic pain in the hands and arms and shoulders from years of guiding logs into the blade. Their hands shook. Their grip weakened. Their fingers went numb. But in that era, there was no workers' compensation. There were no disability payments. There was no recognition that the work itself was destroying the workers. If you couldn't work, you didn't eat. And if the work had damaged you so badly that you couldn't do anything else, well, that was your problem. The mill had other men waiting. I want to tell you about the children. Yes, children worked in sawmills. Boys as young as 10 were employed to do jobs that were considered beneath adult workers, or too cramped for adult bodies. They swept sawdust. They carried tools. They crawled into spaces where adults couldn't fit to oil machinery or clear jams, and they died. They died at higher rates than adult workers because they were smaller and weaker and less experienced. They were caught in belts. They were crushed by falling timber. They made mistakes that experienced workers had learned to avoid, and they paid for those mistakes with their lives. The mill owners justified child labor with the same logic they used to justify everything else. The families needed the income, the boys would learn a trade, the work built character. The same arguments that are always used to justify exploiting children dressed up in the language of opportunity and self-improvement. The reality was simpler. Children could be paid less than adults. Children complained less. Children were easier to control. And if a child died at the mill, the family would often send another child to take his place, because they had no other choice. The mills eventually got safer, not because the owners suddenly developed consciences, because workers organized, because unions formed, and because state legislatures, pressured by public outrage over the death toll, finally began passing laws requiring basic safety measures. The first blade guards appeared in the 1910s. Emergency stop mechanisms followed. Safety training became mandatory in some states. Gradually, incrementally, the sawmills became less lethal. But the change came too late for the men who had already died. It came too late for Thomas Henley, for Samuel Briggs, for the thousands of unnamed workers whose blood had soaked into the platforms beside those spinning blades. And here's what bothers me most about this history. We have forgotten them. The lumber that came out of those mills built the America we live in today. The boards that men died to produce became the houses and the churches and the schools and the factories that shaped this nation. Every piece of old-growth timber that went through those screaming blades carried with it a cost in human life that we never acknowledged and never repaid. Walk through any American city built before 1920, and you're walking through structures built from the bodies of sawmill workers, the beautiful Victorian homes with their intricate woodwork, the old downtown buildings with their massive timber frames, the railroad trestles and the mine supports and the barn beams that stretched across the continent. All of it came through those mills. All of it passed by those blades. All of it carries invisibly the blood of the men who made it possible. We owe them a debt we can never pay. The least we can do is remember that they existed. The circular saw blade that spun at 600 miles per hour was a machine of incredible precision and power. It transformed the American landscape. It made possible the rapid expansion of a nation. It was, by any measure, one of the most significant technological developments of the 19th century. It was also a killing machine. It killed indiscriminately and without mercy. It killed men who were careful and men who were careless. It killed veterans of the trade and newcomers alike. It killed because the men who could have made it safer chose not to. It killed because worker lives were valued less than the lumber those workers produced. The next time you touch a piece of wood, I want you to think about this. I want you to think about the men who stood beside the blade. I want you to think about what it cost to turn a tree into a board. I want you to think about the screaming steel and the blood-soaked platforms and the families who lost fathers and sons to machines that could have been made safe but weren't. We built a nation on their bodies. The least we owe them is to remember how they died. The sawmill blade spun at 600 miles per hour, and for decades, men stood beside it and tried not to die. Some of them succeeded. Most of them eventually did not. This is their story. This is what we owe. This is what was paid so that we could have the world we live in today. And it should never be forgotten.